Our final panel for the day are two men who have both hired me at one point or another. They're arguing over me. I'm so flattered. The first presentation we'll hear is from George Weigel. I first came to work for George Weigel at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in 2005. And working with him has been one of the great educational experiences of my life. I still work with him at the Ethics and Public Policy Centers in the Catholic Studies program there. So it's a great pleasure for me to have him here today. George is the Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center, where he holds the William E. Simon Chair in Catholic Studies. He's probably best known for his triptych, biography of Pope St. John Paul II, Witness to Hope, which came out in 1999, followed by The End and the Beginning in 2010, and then more recently in 2017, George's reflections on how he came to write the biography and some of the stories that came along with writing it, called Lessons in Hope. George is the author of, my paper says more than 20 other books. It's a lot. I think more than 20 other books is the correct number, but it's a lot. Most notably for our purposes, The Courage to be Catholic, Crisis, Reform, and the Future of the Church, which came out in 2002, and Evangelical Catholicism, Deep Reform in the 21st Century Church, which came out in 2013. Among his many other duties, he's senior Vatican analyst for NBC News, and his weekly column, The Catholic Difference, is syndicated in some 85 newspapers and magazines in 7 countries. In the time that I have known him, I feel obliged to point out my Chicago Cubs have won as many World Series as his Baltimore Orioles have division titles. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming George Weigel.
Thank you, Steve, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to be here at Catholic University, particularly during Easter week, which is a good week to be thinking about the authentic reform of Christ's Church. Let me begin my remarks with a cautionary tale from 17 years ago, from 2002. In March of that year, just as the abuse crisis was coming to a white-hot boil, a sister of St. Joseph in the Archdiocese of Boston was quoted by syndicated columnist Michael Kelly as saying, "This is our church, all of us, and we need to take it back." That is precisely wrong, and we need to begin any reflection on authentic Catholic reform by recognizing that that is wrong. This is not our church. This is the Lord's church, as the Lord made absolutely clear to his disciples in John 15:16, when he said, "You did not choose me, but I chose you." And therefore, all authentic Catholic reform, and this would be my first point today, is a matter of reform. It's a matter of recovering and cleansing some part of that form of the church which was given by the church by its Lord. Christ constituted the church a certain way, and that constituting form, that constitution of the church in the British sense of constitution, includes episcopal leadership. And that means that there is no authentically Catholic reform that doesn't recognize episcopal headship in the church. Moreover, authentically Catholic reform in light of the Second Vatican Council must recognize that the church is, by the will of Christ himself, episcopally governed so that any authentic Catholic reform in today's crisis will be a reform that recognizes and proceeds from authentic episcopal leadership in the church. And that authentic leadership in our local churches in the United States may well include, this would be subpoint number one, reforms that proceed against, or at least parallel to, a business as usual attitude that too often is the cast of mind in Rome when it comes to addressing the problems that concern us today. So the first point is that authentic Catholic reform is reform, and part of that form is episcopal leadership. At the same time, and this gets us to the second point, it is essential that bishops exercising the headship for which they were ordained recognize that their episcopal authority and lay collaboration are not a zero-sum game, such that as lay collaboration increases, episcopal authority decreases. This is precisely not true as well. It is not the case that episcopal authority erodes as lay collaboration increases. Quite the contrary. Episcopal authority is strengthened by lay collaboration and input. That has been demonstrated already in the church in the United States over the past 17 years in the diocesan review boards that were created in wake of the first abuse scandal in 2002, and many of which function extremely well at the diocesan level and provide a very important model of lay collaboration with episcopal authority. Lay collaboration, however, is also imperative in whatever mechanism for episcopal accountability the bishops adopt in June. That is, I think, a non-debatable point. Whatever mechanism is arrived at, be that national, regional, focused on metropolitan provinces of the church, mechanisms for episcopal accountability, at least in this ecclesial context in the United States, must include the collaborative work of the laity in that episcopal accountability. And looking forward, I would also suggest, as part of my second point here, the imperative of lay collaboration in the selection of candidates for the episcopate. This is almost never done today. The current consultation for assessing possible candidates for the episcopate is far too narrow, and that needs to change. Because what lay people see in a priest of the church and a pastor with whom they are familiar, with whom they've worked, may be things that fellow clergy do not see, maybe things that the nuncio, who is finally responsible for making recommendations on episcopal candidacies to Rome, does not see. And again, that process of the selection of bishops would be strengthened, not diminished, not eroded, by the effective collaboration of knowledgeable, orthodox, prudent lay people. And that has got to be part of the discussion going forward. My third point, which I think picks up on something that my good friend Archbishop Vigneron said earlier this morning, is that this evolving relationship between those who exercise episcopal headship in the church and their lay collaborators must be nurtured by intensified prayer and penance, both of which need to be more frequently undertaken together. This is, as I argued 17 years ago, Does seem like I've been saying the same things for an awful long time here. This is ultimately a crisis of fidelity, and whether we're talking about abusive behavior by clergy or failures of governance in the church, both of those involve a crisis of fidelity, which means that there is an element of spiritual warfare in this crisis. I am, like most people of my generation and theological formation, reluctant to reach for supernatural explanations of terrestrial problems and realities. But I have become absolutely convinced over the course of my life that Satan is not a metaphor. Satan is a reality. And the evil one has attacked the Catholic Church in the United States at precisely the moment when the first fruits of the past 35 years of effort to build what John Paul II called the new evangelization were beginning to be seen. That means that this is an essential moment of purification in the life of our church, and in that purification, both lay people and our bishops need to participate through intensified prayer and penance if we are going to realize the great prospects of the new evangelization. And I think if we keep that in mind, that this is an essential moment of purification in a process that was beginning to reach a first fruition, and which we see in many things around us here in Washington. I don't mean to embarrass my friends from the Dominican House of Studies over here, but go over there and you begin to see the fruits of the new evangelization. In this university, you see the same thing as it continues to intensify its sense of Catholic identity and Catholic mission. You see it around the corner here at St. John Paul II Seminary. You see it in the pilgrims who come to the shrine. This is the new evangelization at work. It's at work in the hundreds of thousands of people who came into the Catholic Church this past Saturday. Think about that. Adults baptized or received into full communion with the church in the middle of this mess. Now, their first act of faith, of course, is in the Lord Jesus Christ, crucified and risen, but they also, as did all of us at the vigil, make an act of faith in the church and implicitly in the church's capacity for renewal and reform. If we keep this in mind, this is a moment of purification, painful but essential, then I think other aspects of this crisis will come into clearer focus, and the various duties that fall upon us in our various states of life in the church will become even clearer. That brings me then to my fourth point, which I've already hinted at, which is that it is essential in addressing these problems today and going forward to keep a balanced view of the contemporary Catholic reality in America, in which abuse and misgovernance are not the whole story. I mentioned the experience of tens, hundreds of thousands of new members of the church this past Saturday. America's seminaries today are fuller than they have been in decades, and as I experience them here and abroad, those seminaries are filled with young men who are not looking for a life of ease, but who are quite serious about being conformed to Jesus Christ, the sacrificial high priest, and who know that they are going to be living their priestly vocation in a public environment in which their choice of vocation is open not only to ridicule and suspicion, but if things continue to unravel in our culture, may open them simply by doing their duty and being who they are to real persecution. It's important to remember in the course of all this the many, many good priests in the Catholic Church in the United States. Some years ago, I was complaining bitterly in an email to John Garvey and my dear friend Marianne Glendon at the Harvard Law School about some episode of legal perfidy or other, can't remember what it was. Marianne, who can have a quite sharp sense of humor sometimes, immediately emailed me back and said, "Come on, George, you can't blame an entire profession for the misbehavior of 500,000 of its members." Well, I will borrow from Professor Glendon and say you cannot condemn an entire national presbyterate for the behavior, the bad behavior, the sins and crimes of 4% of its membership. So I hope that as we go forward, those of us who know, as all of us do, good, faithful, solid, committed priests will thank them for their service, because that is surely part of lay collaboration in the mission of the church. And the same goes for those bishops who are determined to get this fixed, one of whom is sitting with us here today. But Archbishop Vigneron is only one of many, as I'm sure he would say. I have been mucking around in this mess for 17 plus years now, both here and abroad. It's not been fun. But I will say, with complete candor, that I have never seen more determination, more settled determination from a critical mass of U.S. bishops to deal with this than I have experienced over the past 9 months. And that, I think, is part of the story that we keep in mind, that we need to keep in mind. Now, in maintaining that balanced, or if you will, usefully complex view excuse me, of the reality of the church in the United States, it will be essential for lay people to nurture a healthy skepticism about the mass media and its reporting of these issues. As everyone in this room knows, a new Archbishop of Washington, Welton Gregory, was appointed several weeks ago. By my rough count, the major story on Archbishop Gregory in the Washington Post was devoted 3/4 of its column inches to the abuse issue. That is simply disproportionate. That is not the story of the Catholic Church in the Archdiocese of Washington, is not taken up 3/4 by these questions. And then today, for those of you who got past the Capitol's collapse in the sports section and went to the op-ed page, we had once again the Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania, Mr. Josh Shapiro, with an op-ed piece under the headline, "Repairing Notre Dame is important, protecting clergy abuse victims is more important." In that piece, the Attorney General of the state of Pennsylvania repeated the misrepresentations of contemporary Catholic reality that were evident in the grand jury report he presented last August, which was deliberately crafted to present the vision of the Catholic Church as an institution that is essentially a rape culture in the United States today. That image was created by telescoping 80 years of data in such a way as to seem as if it were a report on the present moment. That is simply false. In the 17 years since 2002, the 6 dioceses in Pennsylvania that were subject to that grand jury investigation have reported 17 credible allegations of abusive behavior by clergy. During that same period, there have been hundreds of credible allegations of abusive behavior in the Pennsylvania public schools. There is no grand jury investigation of that. There is no screaming and yelling by the Attorney General about that. There is no media coverage of that. And yet the Attorney General has the, if I may say, unmitigated gall to say in this op-ed piece this morning, where is the sense of urgency and acceptance of responsibility to support the victims and survivors of sexual abuse at the hands of Catholic clergy? Well, Mr. Attorney General, the answer to that question is it's everywhere. It's there in the bishops who have spent hundreds of hours meeting with, praying with, often weeping with victims of abuse. It's there in the $4 billion in settlements that the Catholic Church in the United States has provided, a far too disproportionate amount of which has gone to predatory tort lawyers. This kind of distortion of the Catholic reality by self-seeking politicians in cooperation with a biased media has to be called for what it is. That is no reason for us not to take our mess seriously and fix it, but it is to say we are dealing here with a societal plague. The sexual abuse of vulnerable people, be they young, middle-aged, or old, is a plague throughout all of society. Despite what the Attorney General of Pennsylvania appears unwilling to acknowledge, Catholic Church has actually learned some things about how to deal with that over the last 17 years, to the point where I believe it's empirically demonstrable today that Catholic schools, for example, are the safest environment for young people in the country, including, I will repeat, the public schools of the state of Pennsylvania. So, what I would like to propose to those like Attorney General Shapiro, and what I proposed in a column several months ago in which I reported on former Commonweal and New York Times reporter Peter Steinfeld's 12,000-word demolition of the Pennsylvania grand jury report, I would like to propose that our bishops establish a lay body of retired, eminent jurists and legal authorities, which we pay for, to review every one of these Attorney General or grand jury reports as they come out, and with no editing from the Bishops' Conference, provide the whole church an assessment of the credibility of those reports. Why? So that we can, as a national community, begin to get to grips with this problem and bring to bear on it the many things that the Catholic Church has learned about dealing with it over the past 17 years. My fifth point would be that it is essential for all of us, whatever our station of life in the church, to recognize how a culture of dissent in the church from settled Catholic teaching damaged the Catholic ecosystem from which the spike in abusive clergy behavior between the late 1960s and the late 1980s occurred. You will all be aware that this is a point made in a set of notes prepared for the World Episcopate by Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI and released several weeks ago. This was a point that I made as well in the Courage to be Catholic in 2002. There has to be some correlation between the meltdown of doctrinal and moral discipline in the church from the late 60s to the late 1980s and this tremendous spike in abusive behavior. men who had learned to live lives of intellectual duplicity, claiming to represent what the Catholic Church taught, but in fact not believing that and not teaching that, were incredibly more vulnerable to the tsunami of the sexual revolution, such that intellectual duplicity quickly bled over into behavioral duplicity. Now, it must be said, as I wrote yesterday, that this epidemiology of the abuse crisis does not explain everything. It doesn't explain psychopaths like Marcial Maciel and Theodore McCarrick. It doesn't explain the abusive behavior that took place before the Second Vatican Council in traditionalist Catholic bastions like Quebec and Ireland. It doesn't explain many of the challenges that the Church faces in Africa today. But it does help understand that spike in abusive behavior between the late 60s and late 80s and why that ameliorated after that. Those who refused to even discuss this, which was the reaction from large parts of the Catholic commentariat, at least on one side of the spectrum, after the Pope Emeritus's notes were published, those who refused to even discuss this labeled themselves unserious about solving the problem of clerical sexual abuse. Footnote to that. There's been a lot of talk recently about clericalism and the abuse crisis. Let me say for the 223rd time, clericalism is a facilitator of abuse. It is not a cause of abuse. The respect that Catholics properly show to the priesthood of Jesus Christ, manifest in the priests and bishops of the Church, can be used by distorted, warped, wicked personalities to facilitate their sexual predation. That clericalism is a facilitator of abuse, but it's not its cause. Clerical sexual abuse is a huge problem, as we know, in Protestant denominations. It's a huge problem in Christian communities with a married clergy. The clericalism cause is just not true in itself, and it often functions as a distracting trope to prevent us from dealing with some real issues here. By the same token, anyone who suggests that a change in the discipline of celibacy in the Latin Rite Catholic clergy is the answer to this problem is making a very fundamental mistake. Marriage is not a crime prevention program. Celibacy is no more causative of abusive sexual behavior than clericalism. Let's get serious about the epidemiology here. Finally, I think the way forward in all of this requires us to think of mission territory and missionaries in a new way. When everyone in my parish was bringing in their Operation Rice Bowl boxes at the end of Lent, I am of an age to remember the Holy Childhood Society and the collection boxes that we were all given in Catholic school at the beginning of Lent. And if you managed to save $5, it's a lot of money in 1958, I'll tell you, if you were 7 years old. Managed to save $5, you could name a pagan baby. I'm sure there are namers of pagan babies in the room. For some reason, all my pagan babies were named James. I'm not quite sure why, but in any event, I may have even met some of them in Rome wearing red hats recently. I have no idea. They're some of the great hopes of the Church. But in those days, we thought of mission territory as these exotic places to which brave men and women called missionaries went. The exotic places were those kinds of places that the sisters used to cut some of the pictures out of National Geographic, so the 7th grade boys wouldn't get too excited here. That was mission territory. And missionaries were people who went there. What we've been called to recognize by the Second Vatican Council, as authoritatively interpreted by John Paul II and Benedict XVI under the rubric of the new evangelization, is that mission territory is everywhere. Mission territory is your kitchen table, it's your neighborhood, it's your business, your office, your life as a consumer, your life as a citizen. It's all mission territory, and each one of us received a missionary commission on the day of our baptism, whether that was as a child or as an adult. We were told, just as that first band was told in the 28th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, go and make disciples of all nations. Excuse me. Times beyond counting, I, as I'm sure many of you, have been accosted by deeply upset Catholic friends over the past 9 months saying, I have to do something, what should I do? To which my standard reply is, bring someone into or back to the church. That's the first thing that all of us can do, is to be the missionary disciples we were baptized to be, and to be true evangelical witnesses in the mission territory which is all around us. Now, others of us, because of professional competence, certain skills, etc., are going to play other roles in this reform and moving forward. But everyone can be a missionary disciple. And that ultimately is the answer to the crisis of fidelity, which is this Catholic crisis at this moment. And that is something that each one of us can do something about. Thank you.
Introducing President Garvey at the Catholic University of America is sort of an odd task, but President Garvey is the president of the Catholic University of America. This project, the Catholic project, was his brainchild. The work that we have begun and will hopefully do well is really his work. So I am, in lieu of further introduction and biography, I want to say thank you to you for having started this good work and for allowing me to be a part of it. Ladies and gentlemen, President John Garvey.
Thank you, Stephen, and thanks to all of you who are still around. One unmistakable characteristic of the sexual abuse crisis in its current iteration is that it's damaged the credibility of our ecclesial leadership, especially the bishops, those to whom we normally turn for leadership and reassurance and stability in a moment like this are precisely the ones upon whom the most doubt has been cast in the past 9 or 10 months. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. And the work of restoring the trust can't fall entirely on the bishops. This particular moment requires the efforts of all the faithful, precisely because the mission of the church is one which we all share, laity and clergy alike, by virtue of our baptism. As the Second Vatican Council made clear in Lumen Gentium, upon all the laity rests the noble duty of working to extend the divine plan of salvation to all men of each epoch and in every land. Consequently, may every opportunity be given them so that, according to their abilities and the needs of the times, they may zealously participate in the saving work of the Church. This isn't a mission either the laity or the clergy can fulfill without the assistance of the others. So The clergy have a unique and irreplaceable role in the mission, but so do the laity. And for this reason, the question that we're asking today, what can the laity do to fulfill or help or renew and build up the church, has implications that go a long way beyond just the sexual abuse crisis that we're talking about now and episcopal credibility. If we're going to respond effectively and faithfully, we have to explore ways the people of God can help the church become more fully what she is. This means merely shifting the balance of ecclesial power or merely rearranging the division of labor will likely prove inadequate. And to be clear, that changes like that may be necessary, but they can't address the deepest roots of the crisis. Putting too much stress on what we can do runs the risk of confusing the church's saving mission with our own work. This is what George said, what Pope Francis was getting at when he warned in his letter to the American bishops earlier this year. Many actions can be helpful, good, and necessary, and may even seem correct, but not all of them have the flavor of the gospel. To put it colloquially, he said, we have to be careful that the cure doesn't become worse than the disease. We should, as George said, resist the temptation to transform the church into an institution in our own image and in service to our own ends, however noble and urgent those ends might be, because the church is not ours, not the laity's, not the clergy's. In the most proper sense, it is Christ's church. And the work of renewing the church, of building up the church, must be a work marked by fidelity to him. This in no way lessens the real sense of urgency that we all have to acknowledge, bishops and priests and laity alike, to address a crisis that has already festered for too long. I want to talk about a few much more mundane things than George did, to highlight a few areas where I think the role of the laity can be expanded or developed in practical and concrete ways for the good of the church, and rather than trying to deduce a series of proposals for lay action from abstract principles, I'm inclined as a lawyer as I am to look for some areas of ecclesiastical life where lay people ought to be, and in some cases already are, doing the work of renewing and building up the church. Let me start with the domain of ecclesiastical life which indisputably belongs to the laity, and in which every priestly and religious vocation gets its formation, namely the family. Every priest has his first lesson in what it means to be a man and a father in a family. This is where he learns about love and respect for women in the person of his mother. It's where he receives his first formation in the Catholic faith. It's where he learns, or ought to learn, devotion, honesty, courage, forgiveness, mercy, and all the other virtues he'll need to practice throughout his life in priestly ministry. And it is in the family that he learns from those with the requisite experience about sex, its power, its beauty, its meaning, and its end. This is not how every family looks, God knows. And since we're talking about a crisis of sexual abuse, it's worth noting that most sexual abuse happens not in the sacristy or the rectory, but in the home. Still, it's an underappreciated fact that the drastic decline in priestly vocations over a half century and the incidence of clerical sexual abuse increasing have been accompanied by an even more precipitous decline in Catholic marriages. The crisis in marriage and family doesn't fully explain the current abuse crisis, but if the laity are looking for ways to strengthen and renew the church, we would be remiss if we didn't look to our own families and our own role in the formation of the young men who are going to become the next generation of priests and bishops. That's one. This brings me to a second area where I think the laity can help renew the church in its seminary formation. I don't just mean hiring more lay faculty to teach Old Testament at seminaries. There's something to be said for setting seminarians apart during their period of study and discernment, away from distractions and temptations and worldly concerns. There's also something to be said for not insulating men who will become priests from the kinds of distractions, temptations, and worldly concerns they will invariably contend with once they're ordained. Finding ways for greater involvement with lay people, particularly women and married couples, in the formation of seminarians ought to be possible without jeopardizing the integrity and distinctive character of that formation. I've had occasion to observe close hand in my own family the way the Neo-Catechumenal Way deals with young men during and after their seminary years. Young men who are considering the priesthood, young men who are seminarians, newly ordained priests. They're all members of distinct communities within the way, and the other families in their communities know them from the ground up. They know their virtues, they know their sins from the time they're kids. They advise them when they're having problems. They call them out when they put on airs. They thank them for the great service they do the church. I think it's a really healthy environment for priests to be in, filled as it is with lots of ordinary Catholics who have their eyes on you. We can replicate a lot of these features in our parishes. We don't have to join the way to have them. And talking of parishes, I might add that there are more quotidian ways in which the laity can help their parish priests. Parishes make demands on pastors for which 6 years of theology and philosophy are not adequate preparation. From knowing what to do when the boiler fails to knowing how to manage staff and finances, the demands on the parish priest are myriad. Parishioners can not only help our priests learn on the job, there are many aspects of parish life that require expertise a priest should be willing, even eager, to hand over to his flock. This isn't about making parishioners feel important by giving them something to do. It's about making sure that the management and organization of a parish is collaborative and competent. A well-formed priest will not see lay involvement in the parish as a threat to his authority, but as a necessary and welcome collaboration between brothers and sisters in Christ for building up the church. The same holds true, by the way, at the diocesan level. There are many lay chancellors in the United States today. The last three in my archdiocese here have been women, making the most of the competencies that lay people have frees bishops to do the work that the office of bishop exists to accomplish, teaching and sanctifying and governing, and having lay men and women in position to help guide the bishop in his governance of his diocese, as we heard this morning from Archbishop Vigneron, both a help to the bishop and a tonic against the sort of isolation between clergy and laity upon which clericalism thrives and depends. More of this goes on than we sometimes realize. Superintendents of schools and diocesan heads of human resources, chief financial officers are often, maybe even generally, lay people. Christus Dominus, another Vatican II document, proposes the creation of parish and diocesan councils. They are unfortunately still optional, but pastors and bishops should make more use of them, as is done in Detroit and here. On the other hand, the Code of Canon Law requires every parish and every diocese to have a finance council, but unfortunately the roles of finance councils are left to particular law, that is to say, to legislation within the diocese. And I'm sorry to say that some dioceses don't take full advantage of the wisdom that's available to pastors and bishops through this agency. This is a subject on which I have some knowledge firsthand. I'm not completely unsophisticated about matters of auditing, budgeting, finance, and investment, but I wouldn't dare to entrust the university's fortunes to my own knowledge of these matters. We have at the university a vice president for finance. We have an external auditor who gives us audited financial statements every year. We have an internal auditor whose job it is to go looking around the university for risk and calling us out on it. We have an investment council to manage our portfolio, and over all of these we have audit, finance, investment advancement subcommittees and committees on the Board of Trustees to oversee our management. In size and complexity, we're like a middle-sized diocese here, and the affairs of a diocese warrant no less careful lay oversight than ours gets. Let me add a more general observation about governance structures. 2 years ago at the university, our Board of Trustees, after 4 years of deliberations, voted to amend the governance of the university. We were living under an arrangement we had adopted in the 60s when everything was blowing up here and elsewhere in universities around the United States. And the resolution of that fight at the time was to create a Board of Trustees of 50 people about evenly divided between clergy, mostly bishops, on the one hand, and laity on the other hand. This arrangement had three flaws. first, it was so large that individual members didn't feel any responsibility and didn't assume any responsibility for governance of the university. Second, the equal numbers of clergy and laity, combined with supermajority voting requirements for important actions by the board, guaranteed a deadlock on any question that might happen to divide the board along lay and episcopal lines, which we fortunately were able to avoid nearly all the time, but it was still in the background. And third, as a matter of social dynamics, the lay members in the room, in the presence of a large number of bishops and cardinals, tended to defer to them and leave the talking to somebody else. And the bishops, for their own part, having their own dioceses to govern, didn't give sufficient attention to the day-to-day business of the university. So in 2017, we adopted a two-part structure that was sort of like the Harvard Corporation and the Harvard Board of Overseers, or maybe more accurately, like Notre Dame's fellows and Board of Trustees. We have a group of fellows who own the university, and they hold a handful of reserved powers to elect trustees, to amend the bylaws, to appoint the president, and preserve the Catholic character of the university. And they are a group of a dozen or so, 5 or 6 cardinals, 4 archbishops mostly, the president, that's me, and the chairman of the board, and 2 lay trustees. The Board of Trustees is a predominantly lay body of about 35 people with a lay chair and a lay vice chair and lay heads of most committees. I want to point out 2 things about this new arrangement. And it proves the point that another point George was making, that the division of authority between laity and clergy is not a zero-sum game. Under the new arrangement, we give to both groups, episcopacy and laity, more of what they want. First, the new arrangement gives the bishops more ultimate control over the university, not less. They have fail-safe control in a way they didn't in the 1960s. The bishops the fellows can control both the membership of the board, the position of the president, the rules for the board, and the cardinals and bishops comprise more than 2/3 of the board, so it's in their hands. At the same time, as a practical matter, the laity exert much more month-to-month influence over the governance of the university in audit and academic affairs, facilities, finance, student life advancement, and so on. They're engaged in a way they have never been before. And the change in structure has had a striking effect on other aspects of what they have begun to support the university financially in a way that was beyond our wildest dreams. At the time when we began this process of reform, we were raising about $30 million a year. We now raise about $60 million a year because the lay trustees, actually make a difference in governance and they care about it. Okay, so why do I mention this? Because there is a more general lesson in this exercise, for the matter that we're considering today. The 1960s architecture that we once had delicately balanced lay and episcopal roles in a way that gave us a level seesaw, but it left all parties disengaged, discouraged, and reluctant to govern. The new arrangement gives each group more of what it really cares about and needs. As I said, the bishops have fail-safe authority, which they didn't have before. The laity are entrusted with the regular responsibility for governance support, which they have taken up enthusiastically. And this lesson is one we can apply in other venues. Let me just, to take the issue of the moment, the business of lay review boards. The Dallas Charter and the essential norms that we adopted in 2002 say that each bishop should establish a predominantly lay board to review accusations against priests, and this has been very successful. The rule, as people pointed out, to the surprise of some, was not applied to bishops, but that was so for an important legal reason, namely that under canon law we can't have a board that's independent of the bishop, because the bishop holds all the legislative and executive and judicial authority in the diocese, and only the Pope can remove the bishop. So how do we solve that? Let me just point out, just by way of a little side note, this is not an arrangement that is unique to the Catholic Church. There is in American law an almost exact counterpart to this. Robert Mueller held authority to investigate the Russian election interference from the Attorney General who works for the President. There's been a lot of loose talk in the newspapers about could President Trump have fired Robert Mueller? Of course he could. He's the President, and this guy's working for him. That's the way we set up American government. Or to take another example that'll probably reach the Supreme Court next term, didn't this term, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been attacked as unconstitutional because its director is essentially independent of the president. This is not, the way we do this in the Catholic Church is not unique. We do it for a different reason. In American law, our Constitution insists on presidential control over special counsels and members of the Consumer Financial Protection Board or watchdog agencies because we believe in popular sovereignty. If the president is not doing a good job, we can vote him out of office a couple of years later when he's up for re-election. The special counsel and the CFPB have to be subordinate to the president because they're unelected officials, and if the president can't fire them, then we don't have any control over how those people behave. That's why we do it in the federal government. In the church, we do it for a theological reason. It rests on our commitment to apostolic succession. We, Catholics, believe that bishops have been ordained in an unbroken line going back to the apostles, and this chain of witnesses is what guarantees the truth of the Gospels, which were committed orally to the followers of Jesus. And Catholics also believe that the Holy Spirit watches over the church to preserve it from error. So we can't subordinate the bishops to lay oversight without undermining the foundation of our faith. That's something we have to hold on to. But we can design around the problem. And this experience here is a good example. Suppose it's the Bishop of Mayfield that we want to investigate. We could create a group like the Fellows of the University, say the Cardinal Archbishops of Boston, New York, Chicago, Houston, Newark, and the Archbishops of Los Angeles, Washington, Baltimore, and Detroit, and charge them with appointing a review board to review the Bishop of Mayfield. And the review board could file its report with the papal nuncio, or maybe directly with the Congregation for Bishops. But there are ways of doing this that preserve, as they must, the episcopal character of the Catholic Church. But we can involve the laity in doing this. It's not a council of despair. And I should add, that's what the American Catholic bishops are trying to sell to Rome at this moment. Let me add one last example. I'm a civil lawyer, not a canon lawyer. Actually, I would say I'm a common lawyer, not a civil lawyer or a canon lawyer. But I do have a school of canon law under my purview as president, and I pay some attention to their concerns. And here, too, there is room for giving the laity more responsibility. A lot of our canon lawyers these days are lay people. We have some sitting in the room, and they are allowed to serve as judges in marriage cases, on the tribunals that try marriage cases, but they can't preside over those tribunals, nor can they comprise a majority of the tribunal in marriage cases. More to the point, the situation in abuse cases is worse. In those cases, only clergy can judge clergy. There's these procedural norms under the apostolic letter Sacramentorum Sanctitatis Tutela that specify that only priests can serve as judges and prosecutors and notaries and even defense lawyers. Although in a kind of odd dispensation, a layperson will occasionally be allowed to defend an abusive priest, but not to prosecute one. Former Cardinal McCarrick had a lay canon lawyer. Anyway, I think it would be a healthy reform to allow the laity to participate in the very process of doing justice in the very area that they're now most concerned about. It's something that we have got to think about. These are a few examples. I could give a lot more, but I want to say that here at Catholic University, we've started this Catholic project precisely as a way to engage the energies and strengths of the laity in the work of renewal in the church, but in a way that tries to avoid the pitfalls of treating the relationship between laity and clergy as fundamentally antagonistic or as a function of power. It's not. As I've said in the past, the dynamic of power isn't any more adequate as a way of describing that relationship than it is in the relationship between spouses. Collaboration isn't just a buzzword that's supposed to soothe and pacify the laity. The clergy, our priests and our bishops, genuinely need and rely on the help that the laity can provide, and that's what we're trying to do with our project here. So thanks for coming to hear about it.
Thank you, gentlemen. We will have about 20 or 30 minutes for questions. We have a microphone here. Raise your hand. We'll bring the microphone to you. Please ask your question in the form of a question and identify yourself, your affiliation, any other useful information.
Mr. Weigel, George, would you be so kind as to talk just a bit more about how would you envision lay involvement in the selection of bishops, please?
Like many things, this is not really quite as complicated as it might seem. If the pastor of my parish is being vetted for the office of bishop by the Apostolic Nunciature here in Washington, it simply makes sense for the nuncio to consult responsible people in the parish, lay people, not simply brother priests in the Washington Presbyterate, not simply men who are already bishops, as to whether this guy can get the job done. That's not all that difficult to figure out. It would require the nunciature developing over time a body of knowledgeable, prudent lay people who know how to keep their yaps shut about such matters. But I think it would be quite helpful. Lay people see in a pastor things that brother priests and bishops might not see, that would either recommend a man for the episcopate or would raise certain caution flags. So that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. If we're talking about the rector of a seminary or a professor, although the German experience there is not an altogether happy one, one would want to talk to those who had been under his authority as seminarians and perhaps left the seminary, lay faculty who had worked with him when he was a rector, lay members of whatever board governs the seminary, and similarly for professors. The consultation is simply too narrow right now. This takes place within a very closed orbit, in part to protect a process that the Church has spent 200 years reclaiming. Russ Hittinger once pointed out to me one of these astounding bits of information that Russ Hittinger comes up with every now and then, that Pius VII, there were 550, these will be rough numbers, but there were 550 some episcopates in the Catholic Church at the time of Pope Pius VII in the early 19th century. He had a free right of appointment of bishops in something under 10% of those dioceses. The rest were controlled by governments, largely, cathedral chapters, various nobility, etc. Catholic Church spent the better part of 200 years reclaiming the capacity to appoint its own episcopal leadership, and this was one of the great accomplishments of Holy See diplomacy in the 19th and 20th centuries. So today, the Pope has a free right of appointment virtually everywhere except Vietnam and China. But if you claim the right to make those appointments, to order the Church's life by its criteria, not what Duke so-and-so says or what this cathedral chapter wants or what the king of whatever wants, but by our criteria, then you have to own the responsibility for getting it right and getting it right means a broader consultation than takes place now.
Just following up on the last one, broader consultation, that seems good. Does there have to be some sort of dual reporting mechanism to the Vatican so that one report can be checked against the other? I'm thinking in particular from what we've heard, which isn't a full account, of course, but in terms of Mr. McCarrick's appointments, I guess the accounts were that there was information going to the Vatican, but maybe only one stream of information. If you had two streams of information or two streams of inquiry, then it's harder for one report to be twisted, shall we say, or incomplete.
Well, I mean, frankly, I'm more concerned about broadening the consultation and developing the criteria. I have actually been consulted on several of these matters, and I have, as a result of that, written in at least 3 books. I mean, I should have a single key on the keyboard that hits, you hit it, and this 3 pages on refined criteria comes out, so I don't have to retype this all the time. There's no question on the present form, or at least that I've seen, that asks, for example, can this man handle media? Is he good as a public spokesman for the church? I mean, this is crazy. Why aren't we asking that? There's very little about preaching capacity. There's no question that says, can this man explain the teaching of the church on particularly complex or neuralgic issues in the culture in which he's going to be dealing in a compelling way? There are a lot of questions about doctrinal orthodoxy and whatnot, which are very important. There's no question that I've ever seen on one of these inquiries that says how many people has this, excuse me, how many people has this man brought into the church? How many young men have entered the seminary under his influence? How many women have entered consecrated religious life? How is he at marriage preparation? I mean, these are essential qualities in Episcopal leadership. Not that the bishop is going to do all of that by himself, but that a bishop who knows how to do that can help facilitate others doing it. So those are some of the things that concern me, as well as broadening the consultation, which I think would mitigate against some of the problems that you're describing.
My name is Henry Borger. I just wanted to say, Mr. Weigel, that your talk was really terrific. It was one of the best talks that I've heard in this whole series that I've attended. My question, though, is why doesn't the Catholic Church seem to do a better job at responding to distortions and lies in the newspaper, in the media? As the old saying goes, a lie gets halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its trousers. And is there anything the Catholic Church could do to do a better job of responding to this kind of falsehood?
Well, I think in the present environment, it really rests on people like us to respond to the kind of distortions that I was describing in Attorney General Shapiro's op-ed piece today. And I actually did that this morning. I wrote Peter Steinfels at 8:30 this morning. I said, Shapiro's at it again. You need to get on your horse. Here's the op-ed editors, one of the op-ed editors whom I trust's email address. So that's the kind of thing that we can do. I think it is unfortunately the case that the hermeneutic of suspicion has sunk in so deeply, even with Catholics. I mean, this is not just a media problem. that I think lay people are going to have to really take the lead on responding to this stuff. But I do think this notion I mentioned of, we're going to have review boards from here till doomsday, but a panel of distinguished retired jurists to review this. There are now 16 state attorney generals involved in this. Attorneys general, sorry. For the Bishops' Conference to create and fund a panel of distinguished jurists to review those things and without editing, report back to the Church in the United States on their credibility. That's going to take a while, but I think it would be helpful. In terms of the short response stuff, I think that's up to people like us. When the Post spends 3/4 of its story on Archbishop Gregory obsessing about abuse issues here, there, and everywhere, write the paper. What's going on here? Why there's more going on in the Archdiocese of Washington than this, and you never talk about it. But I think this is primarily, and unfortunately for the foreseeable future, a task for lay people. Now, I will say some bishops have been really great about this in terms of response through social media, internet stuff, and whatnot. In my column of April 17th, I mentioned a video, 4 minutes, by Bishop Tom Daly of Spokane, which is just spot on perfect. 4 minutes, dead honest, no excuses, hopeful going forward, give me your help. We need more of that sort of thing in-house. But in terms of responding to this bias, that's got to be us.
My name is Donna Bethel, and I thank you both for your remarks. I found them very enlightening and constructive. I'll put this in a form of a question as requested. Don't you think, and I would very much appreciate a response from both of you, in order to establish the mutual trust that will be necessary in order to build the collaboration that you're recommending, that our bishops, each of them, needs to make a statement of what he knows about the abuse problem. What he has done, he won't need an investigation to say what he knows in the way of cover-up or complicity or even commission. If a bishop is unwilling to say what he knows, and with due regard for privacy rights, why should we trust him? So I would like to see some serious thought and discussion of this kind of an idea, because so far I have heard nothing. And we all have some very specific questions. What do the bishops really know about ex-Cardinal McCarrick? This went on for years, including, I have to say, what did Archbishop Gregory know? Because he worked very closely with Cardinal McCarrick and was even complicit with him in the misrepresentation in 2004 of Cardinal Ratzinger's letter to the USCCB. So I think there are some very serious issues that have to be met head on, and they're going to be painful, but I think they're necessary because I share your hope for a stronger church that will be built on trust and collaboration between the laity and the clergy. Thank you.
I've said a few times that, to my own way of thinking, the news about McCarrick has been much more damaging to the church than the Pennsylvania grand jury report. I felt even before reading Peter Steinfeld's piece, which I recommend to you, that the bishops in Pennsylvania performed much better and very differently from what was reported as the norm in the grand jury report. And the cases that it discussed were mostly like much of the abuse we're talking about in all of these cases, took place between 1965 and 1985, after which it dropped off a lot. But the McCarrick stuff was upsetting for a couple of reasons. One, because it was misbehavior by a bishop, not a priest, and two, because as you say, we all feel as though it just must be the case that more people knew about this than have spoken about it, and if so, why have they not spoken about it? It's that's when I talk about the loss of trust that so many bishops have suffered. I think it's more from that than from the Pennsylvania grand jury report. Now, should everybody declare about McCarrick? Most of them didn't know. Most of them were appointed after the events in question or were in dioceses far removed. Or there are a bunch of people who know and aren't saying, and I think it would help a lot if we knew exactly what transpired. I'd be in favor of it.
Donna, I think a lot of bishops have spoken to the situations of their own dioceses. There are now on the public record long lists of perpetrators, et cetera, et cetera. There's certainly stuff involved in the legal record and a lot of these settlements. Let me say a few things about the McCarrick case. First thing I think we all have to acknowledge here is that psychopaths are very good at fooling people. I was not a friend of Cardinal McCarrick, nor was he a friend of mine. I think that was obvious over many years. It was only in 2002, in the first iteration of this crisis, that I got a call from what I regarded as a responsible reporter who said, I am hearing stories about Cardinal McCarrick. Do you know anything? And I said, well, I have heard rumors, but this is not Stalinist Russia. And until somebody comes forward with an allegation and is willing to put their name and reputation on this happened to me at such and such a date in such and such a place, I will give him what I think is the appropriate presumption of innocence here. Now, the first guy that we know came forward, I mean, whose name we know, was the victim who came to the Archdiocese of New York in the fall of 2017, which immediately launched an investigation, which reported back credible allegation, which report was then confirmed by an independent investigation, which the Archdiocese didn't have to do, but wanted to do to make sure they had this absolutely nailed down, at which point things proceeded on the track that came to light in June of last year. Now, what we now know is that some people were aware of serious issues at the time of these settlements in Newark and Metuchen. That is where, it seems to me, serious responsibility lies. Even if this were done quietly, those involved in those settlements should have warned their brother bishops, this is toxic, have nothing to do with it, don't have any involvement with him, he doesn't come into your diocese, whatever. Second line of responsibility of this, frankly, is in Rome. It is absolutely clear that he was told to stop running around playing his own Vatican Secretariat of State, et cetera, and that was not enforced. And the responsible parties for that, I think, unfortunately, include the Pope Emeritus, the Secretary of State at the time, Cardinal Bertone, perhaps more directly, Cardinal Ray, the Prefect of the Congregation for Bishops at the time. So that's stuff we actually know about. But let's always keep in mind that amidst this not entirely, but to some degree, media-driven sense that nobody's ever telling the truth about anything, that psychopaths are very good at fooling people, including wealthy people and people from a different part of the church that you represent or I represent. Maciel fooled a lot of people among so-called traditional Catholics. McCarrick fooled an enormous number of people among so-called progressive Catholics. So, this capacity to be, a dual personality is something to which we're all vulnerable. And we should not use McCarrick and his sins and crimes as a kind of volleyball in the ongoing Catholic internal culture war. I'll say one more thing about this, since I think most of us who knew Father Benedict Rochelle, founder of the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal, have great respect for him. And Father Benedict, as some of you may not know, was a trained psychologist. He had a PhD in psychology. He was a very skillful therapist. And I asked him one night after the Maciel business had come to light, I said, do you think I said, I hate reaching for this explanation because it's so often a cheap out, but I said, do you think Maciel was demonically possessed? And he thought for a minute. He said, look, I don't know. I never met the man, but judging from outside, I would say he was demonically oppressed. That dark forces had gotten their hooks into him, and things accelerated from there. And I think that has to be part of any analysis of the McCarrick situation as well. We're just not as aware as we ought to be in the church of the early 21st century of the spiritual warfare that is underway all around us. I'm very pleased when I find myself in parishes today that have restored the Leo XIII prayer to St. Michael at the end of Mass. I think that's something we actually should consider as a church throughout the United States, because that is a significant part of what we're dealing with here. And we need to recognize that and make that part of our common prayer.
One more point about, just as a matter of institutional governance, and I think this goes for parishes and orders as well as universities. One of the dangers that this sort of crisis creates for all of us is alongside a desire, or maybe in a kind of excess of desire to root out the problem that we're dealing with, there's a temptation to act on insufficient evidence. And I can't tell you how frequently it happens to me that I'll get a tale once a month, let's say, that so-and-so has reported that so-and-so told him that the person in question is guilty of this or that kind of sexual misbehavior. And it's really important that we guard ourselves against going too far down the road of stamping out evil, because occasionally the stories are not going to be true. I mean, whenever I hear these, I always remind people, remember what happened with Cardinal Bernardine? He was accused by somebody who later recanted the story, but we can't just execute these people on the spot because we have second or third hand information that so-and-so has been misbehaving. One of the small side projects that the Catholic Project is dealing with is this backside of the abuse crisis. In 2002, we adopted, and we had to, a one-strike policy for priests who were guilty of abusive behavior. There has gone along with that a sort of one accusation policy, or one credible accusation policy, not meaning true, but might be true. Priests will get put on the shelf until it gets sorted out. A number of priests have said to me about this, it's really ruined my relationship with my bishop. I don't tell him anything anymore. And you can understand why, because, even if I had a problem, and we all have problems, and there used to be a kind of paternal relationship with bishops, you just can't do that anymore. I had exactly the same conversation from the other side with Cardinal Dolan. He said, God, yeah, it's the worst, it's just been wrecked, my relationship with my priests. There used to be a kind of paternal relationship. People would come and tell me their problems, and we could deal with them and sort them out. We're all human. And of course, you can't talk about this externally, because people will say, well, yeah, but you're not dealing with the real problem. There's a lot of pervs out there, and you gotta sort them out. And so we do. And if more bishops had done their job, we wouldn't have been in the mess in 2002. And so that's all true. And I'm not suggesting that we should have a different policy than we do, but I want to emphasize that it's not the policy that we use in civil law for locking people up or firing them from their jobs. It's much harder on priests, and it has changed the internal dynamic of how our clergy relate to one another, and there's a real loss in that. And we at Catholic institutions have to keep this in mind when we're dealing with accusations. And it's a really scary thing, because if you guess wrong one way or the other, you're going to ruin a life, and you don't know which way the life is ruined. But apropos of people confessing what they know, I just want to say, be sure you know it before you confess it.
I'm Mike Gerard. I'm from the Canon Law School here. I thank you for your deference to our concerns. I was wondering, President Garvey, do you think, as a common lawyer, of course, there's a difference in, tradition between sort of canon law, continental European law, and, common law in America. Do you think that the theoretical structural differences, do you think that will have any effect on reform efforts in the United States specifically? Because canon law is sort of a different system than what we're dealing with here.
I do think we would all benefit from a better knowledge of canon law. I had another conversation 3 nights ago with a friend of mine who serves on one of these advisory boards around New York City, and he was saying people tend to defer to the bishop or the archbishop on matters where they really ought to be probing further, because they don't understand whether this is a canon law issue that they just don't understand, or whether it's they don't know what the limits of their own ignorance are. And it is the case that we bumped up against this in doing our own corporate reorganization here at the university. I hired a civil lawyer from McGuire Woods, who was a nonprofit reorganization specialist, and I hired a canon lawyer, and I also hired a nonprofit turnaround consultant just to bring about the change. And there were occasions when the law of one kind would point us in one direction, and the law of another kind would point us in another. And let me give you an example of this, which actually had something to do with the motives for reform. Some years ago, in my time, we sold a few acres of land across Harewood Road to the shrine. The Rosary Garden that's there sits on this property that we sold. And one of the issues that when I became president, Monsignor Rossi, who was then is now the rector, said, "Did I want to serve on the shrine board?" And I said, "No. I mean, ask me later. But we've been talking about selling this land, and I don't want to be on both sides of that transaction." But Monsignor was on our board, and Cardinal Wuerl was on both sides of the transaction. You know, he's the chairman of the shrine board. He's the chancellor of the university. And there were a number of other bishops who were on our board and also on the shrines board. And I found a real difference of understanding of this problem between the bishops and the lay members of the board. The lay members of the board saw this dealing between us and the shrine, which had overlapping boards and were neighbors, and they sit on some land of ours, and we have all kinds of dealings together, as a matter of a sort of conflict of interest. You know, there was a concern that we might do them a favor to the disadvantage of the university, sell the land cheaper than we should. So in the end, or in the beginning, I hired an outside consultant to give us a fair value for the land, so that was somebody else's decision. But even so, there was a concern about this being a conflict. I had a long discussion with the cardinal about this, and he was really thoughtful about this kind of problem. He said, "Look, usually in civil law, when we have problems like this that we consider conflicts, the proper course of action is to recuse yourself, either from discussion or at least from voting on the matter." He said, "I couldn't do my job if I did that. I'm in charge of 40 boards around here. I mean, just to take a few examples, on the administrative board of the USCCB, the chairman of the board of the Shrine, the chairman of the board of Archbishop Carroll High School, the chairman of the board of the John Paul II Seminary, on the board of the John Paul II Center, the chancellor of the university." And that's just to get started. You know, say nothing about Catholic Charities and Catholic. He'd be the corporate member of all these. If he had to step out when any of those organizations dealt with one another, he'd be out of business, and he couldn't be the Archbishop of Washington anymore. And what's more, he said, from the church's point of view, this is not a matter of conflict, but a matter of communion. We're doing this together. This is, there's a really profound difference in the ways of understanding this. Canon law will reflect this, but there's a theology underneath the canon law that's very different from the ideology underlying the civil law. And yeah, sometimes it's very hard to bring them both together. But it's important too. I mean, if we, for example, take the civil law point of view on all this, then we could disqualify all of the bishops on the old board, and half of the board would be shoved out of the way. It was that sort of potential conflict that led us to look for a different way of running things. So, I think people who are involved in the affairs of the church and its parachurch institutions would really benefit from a better understanding of what the law governing the church's affairs is. I think it's more important than we realize. Not you, but most people.
Well, two quick notes on that. I have benefited immensely from, in my understanding of how these issues play out globally, by my work at the last two synods in 2015 and 2018, and then this past February at the Abuse Summit. And one of the things that I have learned that I think perhaps many of us are not as aware of, I certainly wasn't aware of till I spoke at length with third world bishops, is that we have a canonical infrastructure in this country that simply doesn't exist, even in Latin America. I mean, we assume that because the faith has been in Latin America for 500 years, they have a functioning tribunal system and all this. They don't. I mean, if you're in Peru and you want to seek an annulment to your marriage, you have to go to Argentina. I mean, it's a completely different situation. So my first point is that one of the things that American canonists need to start figuring out is how we can help brethren around the world to get mechanisms in place for addressing all sorts of issues from marriage law to this abuse stuff. Second point is that simply because we have resources and infrastructure, and therefore can think with some freedom about creatively addressing lay Episcopal collaboration, we should go ahead with that and own that, and we should tell the authorities in the Holy See, don't give us the red light just because everybody else can't do it. Okay? We might actually provide some modeling here that others down the line might wish to adopt, again, with our help in building some of that infrastructure. But there was a dynamic in February, particularly, in Rome that, well, you know, you guys want to run ahead of the pack and nobody has your infrastructure and resources, therefore we're giving you the red light. No. No. You have, we want to be synodal and collegial and all that good stuff. Give us the green light to do what we responsibly think we ought to do, and we'll share what we've learned about that with others, including resources. Well, we're about to find out in the next 3 months.
Well, I know this Archbishop Lori actually implemented in Baltimore something very like the review process for bishops.
Yeah, no, look, there's lots of stuff we can do that we don't have to wait for, you know, higher authority to do. But this is a dynamic in the thing that people need to be aware of. And frankly, on the Roman side of this, that's sometimes an excuse for just not dealing with anything. I mean, that needs to be said, too. Patience and firmness are the watchwords.
Thank you to our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause.